The wind did not just blow across the plains of Wyoming territory. It scoured them. It came screaming down from the Bighorn Mountains, stripping the warmth from the earth and the hope from a man's bones. It was a living, hateful thing, carrying grit and ice crystals that stung exposed skin like birdshot. Luke Callahan pulled the collar of his sheepskin coat higher, tucking his chin against the biting chill. He was a man built of hard angles and silence, 32 years old but looking 10 years older around the eyes. He stood knee-deep in a drift of snow that had hardened into a crust like iron, his gloved hands wrestling with a strand of barbed wire that had snapped in the night. The metal was brittle with cold, fighting him as if it had a mind of its own. Around him, the landscape was a study in desolation. The cottonwood trees lining the creek bed were stripped bare, their skeletal branches scratching frantically against a sky the color of a bruised plum. The creek itself was a sullen ribbon of black water choking under creeping shelves of gray ice. Several yards away, a small cluster of Hereford cattle huddled together, their backs to the wind, tails tucked. They were too thin. Luke could see the ridges of their ribs even through their winter coats, and the sight settled a heavy stone of worry in his gut. He twisted the wire, the pliers slipping in his numb grip, before finally securing the splice. He tested it with a sharp tug. It held. It would have to hold. He did not have the money for new wire, just as he did not have the money for extra grain or a new coat to replace the one that was wearing thin at the elbows. Luke straightened, his back popping audibly in the frigid air. He looked out toward the horizon, where the peaks of the mountains were already lost behind a veil of descending white. A storm was coming. He could smell it, a metallic ozone scent that cut through the smell of sage and cow manure. It was late December, the time of year when the high plains tried their hardest to kill anything foolish enough to remain upon them. He slapped his gloves together to force blood back into his fingers and turned toward the house. It was a rough-hewn log structure, low and squat, hunkered down against the wind like a badger in a hole. Smoke was whipped horizontally from the chimney the moment it escaped. It was a lonely place, miles from the nearest neighbor and 10 miles from the town of Red Willow. But that was how Luke wanted it. Isolation was safer. Isolation did not ask questions. He stomped the snow from his boots on the porch and pushed open the heavy door. The warmth hit him instantly, smelling of wood smoke and the simple rabbit stew simmering on the cast-iron stove. "Daddy?" The voice was small, barely louder than the crackle of the fire. Annie sat at the rough pine table, her legs swinging where they did not touch the floor. She was 7 years old, a wisp of a girl with hair the color of dried wheat and eyes that were far too big for her face. She was wrapping a scrap of red yarn around a pine cone. "Hey there, Button," Luke said, his voice softening instantly. The roughness that coated him outside fell away the moment he crossed the threshold. He hung his coat on the peg and walked over to her, placing a large, calloused hand on her head. "You stay warm while I was out?" Annie nodded, but before she could answer, a cough rattled deep in her chest. It was a wet, barking sound that made Luke's blood run cold. He froze, his hand still on her hair, waiting for it to pass. Annie hunched her small shoulders, wheezing for a moment before taking a shallow breath. "I am fine," she said quickly, looking up at him with an apology in her eyes. "It is just a tickle." Luke forced a smile he did not feel. "Sure it is, but you stay close to that stove. You hear? I do not want you catching a chill." He moved to the stove to stir the stew, his hand trembling slightly on the wooden spoon. That cough was a ghost that haunted the cabin. 2 years ago, a fever had swept through the valley, taking children from sturdy brick houses in town and drafty shacks alike. Annie had burned with heat for 4 days, thrashing and crying out for her mother. Luke had sat by her side every second, sponging her forehead, terrified that he was about to lose the last good thing in his life. She had survived, but the sickness had left her lungs weak. Every winter since, the cold seemed to reach into her chest and squeeze. Luke looked at the window, where frost was already fern-patterning the glass. It reminded him of another winter, 7 years ago. He closed his eyes for a second, fighting the memory. But it came anyway. It always came with the snow. He remembered the night Maggie died. It had been a storm, like the one brewing now. She had gone into labor early, her face pale and beaded with sweat. He had ridden for the doctor in Red Willow, pushing his horse until the beast's lungs nearly burst, fighting through drifts that reached his stirrups. But the doctor had been drunk, or the road too bad. The memory was a blur of panic and rage, and by the time they returned, the silence in the cabin was absolute. Maggie was gone. She had bled out while he was fighting the snow. All that was left was a tiny, squalling infant wrapped in a blanket, and a hole in Luke's soul that was vast and echoing. The guilt was not a sharp pain anymore. It was a dull, constant ache in his bones, as familiar as the rheumatism in his shoulder. He had failed to protect his wife. He would not fail his daughter. That was why they stayed away from town. Red Willow was a hard place, full of hard people. The townsfolk looked at him with a mixture of pity and judgment. The poor widower, they whispered. The man who lived like a hermit. They judged him for raising a girl alone on a ranch that was barely scraping by. They judged him for not remarrying, for not attending the church socials, for not being one of them. He had seen the way the town treated those on the margins. Just last month, when he had gone in for flour and coffee, he had seen a young woman from the saloon walking down the boardwalk. She had been pretty, in a tired sort of way, wearing a dress that was too bright for the morning light. Two matrons from the church committee had stopped talking as she passed, pulling their skirts back as if her shadow might stain them. They had whispered behind their hands, their eyes sharp as flint. He had seen a mixed heritage trapper denied a seat at the lunch counter, told to take his food out to the alley. He had heard the shopkeeper, Mr. Henderson, sneer about respectable people when a family of dirt-poor homesteaders tried to buy seed on credit. Luke wanted none of that for Annie. He wanted to build a wall of distance between her innocence and their cruelty. But looking at the empty larder and the darkening sky, he knew he could not keep the world at bay forever. 10 miles away, the stagecoach lurched violently as it hit a rut in the frozen road, sending its passengers colliding into one another. The inside of the coach smelled of damp wool, unwashed bodies, and old tobacco. Clara Hart gripped the leather strap hanging from the ceiling, her knuckles white. She sat squeezed between a large man in a buffalo coat who smelled of onions and a thin, sour-faced woman clutching a Bible. Every jolt of the wheels sent a fresh wave of exhaustion through Clara's body. She had been traveling for 3 days, sleeping upright, eating only hard biscuits and dried apples. She was 28 years old, though she felt 50. She wore a plain gray wool dress, high-collared and severe, with a simple bonnet covering her dark hair. To the casual observer, she looked like a governess or perhaps a widow in mourning. There was no trace of the silk dresses, the painted lips, or the scent of cheap lavender water that had defined her life for the past 6 years. But Clara felt the phantom weight of those silks on her skin. She felt the ghost of the paint on her mouth. She was terrified that everyone else could see it too. The stagecoach driver shouted something unintelligible from the box, and the vehicle began to slow, the brakes shrieking against the iron rims of the wheels. "Red Willow," the driver bellowed. "End of the line." Clara took a steadying breath. End of the line. She hoped it was true. She hoped this was the place where the running stopped. She had left the mining town of Silver Creek 2 weeks ago in the middle of the night. She had slipped out while he was sleeping. Jericho, the man who called himself her protector but treated her like a prize dog he could kick when it didn't perform. He had been heavy with whiskey, his snoring shaking the thin walls of the room he kept her in. She had taken nothing that wasn't hers, except for the freedom she stole and the bruises on her upper arms where he had grabbed her too hard the night before. She had moved 3 times since then. Each time, she found work. Each time, someone recognized the way she walked, or the tilt of her chin, or simply decided a woman alone with no kin must be of loose morals. The whispers would start, then the propositions, then the dismissal. The stagecoach rocked to a halt. The door was flung open, letting in a blast of icy wind that cut right through Clara's coat. She stepped down into the slush of the street. her worn boots sinking into the mud and ice. Red Willow was not much to look at. It was a single main street lined with false-fronted buildings that looked like they were huddled together for warmth. There was a general store, a livery stable, a hotel, a church with a white steeple that looked like a jagged tooth against the gray sky, and, of course, the saloon. The wind howled down the street, rattling the signs and flapping the canvas awnings. Clara pulled her single carpet bag from the boot of the stagecoach. It was light. She owned very little. She stood on the boardwalk, smoothing her skirts, trying to look respectable, trying to look like she belonged. She felt the eyes immediately. Two men standing outside the livery stable stopped their conversation to watch her. Their gazes were heavy, physical things. They swept over her, stripping away the gray wool, assessing the curve of her waist and the fullness of her bust. It was a look she knew well, the look of men measuring a commodity. Across the street, a woman in a heavy velvet cloak paused on the steps of the dry goods store. She looked at Clara, her eyes narrowing. She took in the worn bag, the solitary status, the face that was perhaps a little too weary for a respectable woman of her age. The woman whispered something to her companion, and they both turned away, presenting their backs like a shield. Clara lifted her chin. She would not let them see her fear. She walked toward the sign that read boarding house. The interior was warm, smelling of floor wax and baking bread. A stout woman with gray hair pulled into a severe bun stood behind a counter. She smiled as Clara entered, but the smile faltered as she took in Clara's appearance. "Good afternoon," Clara said, her voice steady and soft. "I am looking for a room, ideally for a week, perhaps longer if I can find employment." The woman, Mrs. Abel, looked at the carpet bag. She looked at Clara's ringless hands. "Are you expecting family, miss?" "No, ma'am. I am alone. I am hoping to find work as a seamstress, or perhaps in domestic service." Mrs. Abel's face closed down. The warmth evaporated. "I see. Well, I'm afraid we are quite full up. The holidays. You understand?" Clara looked around the empty common room. The key rack behind the desk was full. "Ma'am, surely you have one room. I can pay in advance. I have $2. Mrs. Abel stiffened. "It is not about the money. We are full. Good day." Clara stood for a moment, the humiliation burning her cheeks. She turned and walked out. She tried the general store next. The proprietor, a balding man with ink-stained fingers, looked her up and down. "Work?" he asked. "No work here for a woman. My wife handles the books." He leaned over the counter, his voice dropping to a greasy whisper. "Unless you are looking for other arrangements? There is a room in the back if you are not particular." Clara felt bile rise in her throat. "No, thank you," she said, her voice brittle as ice. She walked back out into the wind. The cold was seeping into her toes, making her feet feel like blocks of wood. She tried the small cafe at the end of the street. The owner, a harried-looking man, shook his head before she even finished her sentence. "I don't need trouble," he muttered, glancing out the window at the church across the street. Clara followed his gaze. Standing on the steps of the church was the woman in the velvet cloak she had seen earlier. She was talking to a tall, severe-looking man in a black coat. The preacher, presumably. The woman pointed a gloved finger directly at Clara. That was Mrs. Ralston. Clara didn't know her name yet, but she knew the type, the gatekeepers of decency, the women who believed that virtue was a limited resource and that destroying a fallen woman was a way to hoard more for themselves. "Mrs." Ralston said something to the preacher, her face pinched with righteous disapproval. Clara turned away, pulling her shawl tighter. The sun was beginning to set, the light failing rapidly. The wind was picking up, screaming around the corners of the buildings. She had nowhere to go. She had less than $3 in her coin purse. If she slept outside tonight, she would freeze. She looked down the street. At the far end, light spilled from the frosted windows of the saloon. Piano music tinkled faintly against the roar of the wind. It was the one place she had promised herself she would not go. It was the place that smelled of her past. But the cold was a physical pain now, gnawing at her extremities, swallowing her pride. Clara walked toward the saloon. She did not go through the swinging doors. She went to the side entrance, marked rooms. The proprietor was a heavy man with a thick mustache and eyes that had seen everything and cared about nothing. He sat in a small office that smelled of stale cigar smoke. $1 a night, he grunted, barely looking up from his ledger. In advance. No guests after 10 o'clock. No loud noises. It is just me, Clara said quietly, placing a silver dollar on the desk. It was a fortune. It was half of what she had left. Key is number 4. Upstairs, second door on the left. Clara took the heavy iron key. She climbed the narrow stairs, the wood groaning under her feet. The hallway was dark and smelled of dust and old beer. Room 4 was small. It contained a narrow iron bed with a lumpy mattress, a washstand with a cracked pitcher, and a single chair. The window looked out over the alley, rattling violently in its frame as the wind buffeted the building. It was freezing. There was no stove, only the heat rising from the saloon floor below. Clara set her bag down on the bed. She sat on the edge of the mattress, keeping her coat on. She could hear the laughter of men downstairs, the clinking of glass, the heavy thud of boots. It sounded like Silver Creek. It sounded like every nightmare she had tried to escape. She brought her hands up to her face and breathed into them, trying to find a spark of warmth. She was safe from the wind. At least, she had a roof. She would survive the night. But as she looked around the dingy room, lit only by the gray twilight fading in the window, she felt a crushing sense of defeat. She had run hundreds of miles to start over, only to end up in a room exactly like the one she had left, just above a saloon, with the town judging her before she had even spoken a word. I will find work tomorrow, she whispered to the empty room. I will scrub floors. I will wash laundry. I will make them see I am decent. The wind howled outside, a mournful, lonely sound that seemed to mock her. Back at the homestead, the world had shrunk to the circle of light cast by the kerosene lamp on the table. The wind was shaking the cabin now, rattling the heavy door on its hinges. Luke had brought in an extra armload of wood, stacking it high by the stove. He had checked the animals one last time, breaking the ice on the trough and throwing down the last of the good hay. The cattle were huddled in the lee of the barn, snowy statues in the dark. Inside, Annie was humming. It was a thin, reedy sound, broken occasionally by a cough, but it was full of determination. Look, Daddy, she said. Luke turned from the window. They had dragged a scrawny pine branch inside, little more than a sapling that Luke had cut from the ridge. They had propped it up in a bucket of rocks in the corner. It was pathetic, really. A sparse, crooked stick of a tree that listed to the left, but Annie looked at it as if it were a cathedral. She had placed her few treasures on its branches. There were strings of popcorn, mostly stale. There were strips of red fabric tied in bows, and now she was carefully placing a small wooden horse near the base of the trunk. Luke had carved that horse for her 3 Christmases ago. It was rough, whittled from a block of cedar, but it had 4 legs and a tail made of horsehair. It looks majestic. Button, Luke said, forcing the heaviness out of his voice. Annie beamed. It needs a star, she said. We will make one tomorrow, Luke promised. Out of tin. He watched her adjust the horse, her small fingers gentle. She still believed. She believed that Christmas was a time of magic, a time when miracles happened and the world held its breath. She did not know that the feed bill at the livery was 2 months overdue. She did not know that the flour barrel was scraping bottom. She did not know that Luke had skipped his own dinner so she could have a full bowl of stew. He felt a surge of fierce, terrifying love for her. She was the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. If the cold took her, Luke shook his head, physically dispelling the thought. He walked over and scooped her up. She was light, too light. Time for bed. Little bird, the storm is getting loud. He tucked her into the bed in the corner, piling 3 quilts on top of her. He heated a brick on the stove and wrapped it in flannel. sliding it down to her feet. "Will Santa Claus come in the snow?" Annie asked, her eyes heavy. "He has a sleigh," Luke said, smoothing her hair. "Snow makes it easier for him." He waited until her breathing evened out into sleep. Then he walked back to the table and turned down the lamp. The cabin plunged into semi-darkness, lit only by the orange glow of the embers in the stove grate. Luke sat in his chair, staring at the scrawny tree. He felt the weight of the years pressing down on him. The loneliness was a physical thing tonight, sharpened by the holiday. He missed Maggie. He missed the sound of her voice, the way she used to hum when she cooked, the way she could make this drafty cabin feel like a palace. Outside, the wind changed pitch. It stopped shrieking and began to roar, a deep bass rumble that shook the floorboards. The temperature was dropping fast. Luke could feel the draft searching for cracks in the chinking. He stood up and walked to the window, scratching a hole in the frost with his fingernail. Outside, the world was gone. There was no sky, no mountains, no barn. There was only a wall of white, swirling and churning in the dark. The storm wasn't just coming. It was here, and it was going to be a bad one. Luke looked back at the sleeping form of his daughter, then at the rifle leaning against the door, and finally at the empty chair where his wife should have been. "Merry Christmas, Maggie," he whispered into the silence. The wind slammed against the cabin wall like a fist, and the long night began. The dawn did not break over the high plains so much as the darkness simply turned a shade of bruised, angry gray. The storm that had threatened the previous evening had unleashed its fury during the night, transforming the world into a chaotic, white hell. Luke Callahan woke to the sound of the cabin groaning. The heavy timber rafters above his head creaked in protest, a low, rhythmic complaint against the mounting weight of the snow piling on the roof. The wind outside was no longer just a gale. It was a physical assault, hammering against the chinking of the logs with a violence that made the sturdy structure shudder. He sat up, his breath blooming in the frigid air like a cloud of steam. The fire in the cast-iron stove had burned down to embers, and the cold had reclaimed the room with aggressive speed. Luke swung his legs out of the bed, his feet hitting the rough plank floor. The cold bit instantly through his wool socks. He moved quickly to the stove, his movements efficient and practiced. He opened the iron door and shoved in 3 split logs of seasoned pine, blowing on the coals until they glowed bright orange and the wood caught with a hungry snap. He adjusted the damper, listening to the roar of the fire as it fought back against the chill. Once the fire was catching, Luke walked softly to the corner of the room where Annie slept. She was a small mound under a heap of quilts, only the top of her head visible. He placed a hand gently on the blankets, checking for the rhythmic rise and fall of her breathing. It was steady, though slightly raspy. She was warm enough for now, burrowed deep like a hibernating animal. Luke moved to the window. The frost on the inside of the glass was thick, a fern-like pattern of ice that obscured everything. He scraped a circle clear with the edge of his thumbnail and peered out. There was nothing to see. The barn, the corral, the line of cottonwoods, all of it had been erased. The air was a churning wall of white. The snow was not falling down. It was driving sideways, propelled by a wind that shrieked across the open prairie. It was a whiteout, the kind of storm that killed cattle where they stood and buried men who lost their way between the house and the woodpile. Luke leaned his forehead against the cold glass. The supply wagon. It was supposed to have arrived yesterday afternoon from Red Willow. He had waited, hoping the driver, Old Man Miller, had just been delayed. But Miller had not come, and now, looking at the violence outside, Luke knew the wagon would not be coming today either. His stomach tightened. They had enough firewood for 2 days if they were careful. But food was low. The flour barrel was nearly empty. There was no fresh milk. And Annie needed her tonic. The thick syrup the doctor prescribed to keep her lungs clear when the weather turned like this. The bottle on the shelf held only a few drops. He turned back to the room, the gray light casting long shadows. He was trapped. And for the first time in years, the isolation he had cultivated so carefully felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb. 5 miles away in the town of Red Willow. The morning was equally grim. Clara Hart woke shivering. The room above the saloon was essentially an icebox. The single window rattled in its frame, letting in drafts that cut through the thin blanket she had pulled up to her chin. She could see her own breath puffing in the air, rhythmic white clouds that dissipated into the gloom. She lay there for a moment, staring at the stained plaster ceiling, wishing she could simply go back to sleep and not wake up until spring. But the hunger in her belly was a sharp, nagging pain. She sat up, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders, and reached for the water pitcher on the washstand. The water inside was frozen solid. She had to crack the ice with the handle of her hairbrush just to splash her face. Clara dressed quickly, her fingers stiff and clumsy as she fastened the buttons of her plain wool dress. She pulled on her boots, which were still damp from the day before, and wound her shawl tight around her chest. She went downstairs. The saloon was empty of patrons at this hour, smelling of stale beer, sawdust, and the lingering odor of unwashed bodies. The owner, a thick-necked man named Mr. O'Malley, was behind the bar, counting coins into a lockbox. He looked up as Clara came down the stairs, his eyes flat. "Morning," he grunted. "Good morning," Clara said, keeping her voice steady. She walked to the bar. "Mr. O'Malley. About the rent, I was hoping—" He cut her off with a wave of his hand. "I run a business, not a charity. Miss Hart, room is $1 a night. You paid for last night. If you want to stay tonight, it is another $1. Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks. "I do not have another $1. Not yet, but I am willing to work. I can cook. I can clean." O'Malley looked her up and down, chewing on the end of an unlit cigar. "I have a cook, but the floor is a mess. Mud and spit and God knows what else. And the spittoons need emptying. The glasses need washing." "I will do it," Clara said quickly. "It is dirty work," he said, a smirk touching his lips. "Not the kind of work a lady like you is used to. I reckon. I am not afraid of work," Clara said, lifting her chin. O'Malley shrugged. "Suit yourself. Scrub the floor, clean the spittoons, wash every glass on the shelf. Do a good job, and I will let you stay tonight. I might even give you a bowl of stew, but no coin. I accept," Clara said. For the next 4 hours, Clara Hart was on her knees. The water in the bucket was freezing, turning her hands red and raw. The floor was rough and splintered, tearing at her skirts. She scrubbed until her shoulders burned, moving backward across the room, pushing away the filth of the previous night. She emptied the brass spittoons, holding her breath against the stench, and polished them until they shone. She was scrubbing near the door when it burst open, slamming against the wall with a violence that made her jump. A gust of wind and snow swept into the room, followed by a man who looked more like a snowman than a human being. He stumbled in, kicking the door shut behind him. He was wrapped in a buffalo coat that was caked with snow, his beard a solid block of ice. He pulled the scarf from his face, revealing skin that was waxy and pale. It was one of the hands from the Box T Ranch. A man named Elias. "Whiskey," Elias croaked, limping toward the bar. "Give me the bottle." O'Malley slid a bottle and a glass down the polished wood. Elias poured a trembling shot and downed it. Then another. He shuddered, the warmth slowly returning to his eyes. "It is hell out there," Elias said, his voice raspy. "Absolute hell. I barely made it from the livery. What are you doing in town?" "Elias," O'Malley asked. "I thought you boys were hunkering down. I came in yesterday for supplies." Elias said, "Got stuck when the storm hit. But listen, I was talking to the liveryman. He said the wagon for the Callahan place never left yesterday. Miller got drunk and passed out in the tack room." O'Malley shrugged, wiping a glass. "So, Luke Callahan can wait a day." "You do not understand," Elias said, slamming the glass down. "The supply order, it had medicine in it, for the little girl, and flour. They are out there with nothing." Clara, who had been wringing out her rag into the bucket, froze. She looked up from the floor. That girl is sickly, Elias continued. The widower. He keeps to himself, but he dotes on that child. If they do not get that wagon, and this storm holds for 3 days like they say it will— Elias trailed off, shaking his head. Well, ain't nothing to be done now, O'Malley said. Sheriff Miller is busy dealing with a collapsed roof over at the widowmaker's place, and nobody is fool enough to ride out to Callahan's in this. It is 10 miles of open ground. A man would die before he got halfway. Clara stood up. Her knees cracked and her back ached, but she wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the bar. How far is it? She asked. The 2 men turned to look at her. O'Malley frowned. What is it to you, girl? Get back to scrubbing. I asked how far, Clara said, her voice stronger than she felt. Elias looked at her, blinking. 10 miles, northwest, but the trail is gone. Miss, it is buried under 3 feet of drift. Clara looked at the window, where the white fury battered against the glass. She thought of the cold room upstairs. She thought of the way the townspeople looked at her, like she was something broken, something dirty. And then she thought of a little girl, sick and cold, waiting for a father who couldn't feed her. She remembered her own childhood, huddling in a tenement room while her mother coughed her life away, the fireless grate mocking them. She remembered the helplessness. I will go, Clara said. O'Malley laughed, a harsh, barking sound. You? You would not last a mile. I can ride, Clara lied. She had ridden horses in her youth, on her uncle's farm, but that was a lifetime ago. And I need the money. If I take the supplies— Will you pay me? O'Malley scoffed. I am not paying you to commit suicide. I will pay, Elias said quietly. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. The boss gave me money to pay for the delivery. $5. It is yours if you get the medicine to the girl, but— He paused, looking at her slender frame. Miss, it is suicide. I will go if someone shows me the way, Clara said. Elias looked at her for a long moment. He saw the desperation in her eyes, but he also saw something steel hard. He sighed. I can't let a woman go alone. My horse is spent, but I can borrow a fresh one from the livery. I will ride with you as far as the ridge. From there, you can see the chimney smoke if the wind clears. Clara nodded. I will get my coat. Luke Callahan stood in the center of his cabin, pulling on his coat. It was an old woolen thing, patched at the elbows and fraying at the cuffs. It was not heavy enough for this weather, but it was all he had. Daddy? Annie's voice was small from the bed. Where are you going? Luke turned, forcing a bright smile onto his face. Just checking the lines. Button, and I think I might ride out a bit and see if I can spot Mr. Miller's wagon. He might be stuck in a drift. You will be cold, Annie whispered. I will be fine. I'm a tough old bird. Remember? Luke walked over and kissed her forehead. Her skin was warm, too warm. The fever was flirting with her again. He went to the woodpile and stacked the stove full. Listen to me, Annie. You stay in this bed. If the fire gets low, you do not get up. You just wrap another quilt around you. I will be back before dark. I promise. He put on his hat, pulling it low, and wrapped a scarf around his face. He grabbed his gloves and the rifle, though he didn't know what good a gun would do against the wind. He stepped out the door and was instantly blinded. The world was a swirling vortex. He had to feel his way to the barn, keeping a hand on the guide rope he had strung up years ago for just this purpose. Inside the barn, the air was still but freezing. His mare, Bess, nickered softly. She was a sturdy animal, but she was getting old. Luke saddled her quickly, his fingers numb and clumsy with the buckles. Sorry, old girl, he murmured, stroking her neck. I know it is madness, but we have to try. He mounted up and rode out into the teeth of the storm. The journey was a nightmare from the first step. Clara and Elias rode out of Red Willow with their heads ducked against the wind. The snow was not falling. It was being driven horizontally like needles. Clara was riding a roan gelding from the livery, a beast that seemed as unhappy about the situation as she was. She had tied the saddlebags tight, checking 3 times that the medicine bottle was wrapped securely in wool. She wore her own coat, plus a rough canvas duster Elias had lent her. It was too big, hanging off her frame, but it broke the wind. They moved at a crawl. The horses waded through drifts that reached their chests, lifting their legs high and plunging them down again. The wind roared in Clara's ears, a constant, deafening static that drowned out her own thoughts. She was terrified. Every gust of wind threatened to peel her from the saddle. Her legs ached from gripping the horse's barrel, and her hands were frozen claws inside her gloves. She could not feel her feet. She looked over at Elias. He was a dark shape in the white blur, hunched over his saddle horn. He shouted something, pointing ahead, but the wind stole his words. They rode for what felt like hours, though it might have been only one. The landscape was indistinguishable. There were no landmarks, just endless, shifting whiteness. Gullies were filled in, creating treacherous traps where a horse could step into empty air. They reached a narrow pass where the trail, or where Elias thought the trail was, skirted the edge of a frozen creek bed. The bank dropped away sharply to the right, a white slope leading down to the black ice of the water. "Keep left," Elias screamed over the wind. "Stay close to the rock." Clara nodded, pulling her reins. Her horse tossed its head, fighting the bit. Suddenly, a massive sheet of snow, dislodged by the wind from the ridge above, came sliding down. It wasn't an avalanche, just a heavy slough, but it hit Elias's horse broadside. The horse spooked violently, rearing up and twisting. Elias, already half frozen and stiff, couldn't adjust. He was thrown from the saddle, flying backward. He hit the ground hard, landing on the edge of the slope. He rolled once, crying out, before coming to a stop against a buried shrub. His horse, panicked, bolted forward, disappearing into the white curtain in seconds. "Elias!" Clara screamed. She fought her horse to a standstill and slid from the saddle, sinking to her waist in snow. She scrambled over to him. Elias was clutching his leg, his face gray with pain. He looked up at her, teeth chattering. "Broken," he gasped. "I felt it snap." "We have to go back," Clara yelled, grabbing his arm. "I can help you up. You can take my horse." "No!" Elias shoved her hand away. "No, the horse cannot carry double in this drift. It will founder, and I cannot ride. We cannot stay here." "You go," Elias shouted, his voice straining. "You go on. You are closer to Callahan's than to town now. Just over that ridge, 2 miles, maybe 3. I am not leaving you. You have the medicine." Elias grabbed her coat, his eyes fierce. "That little girl. She needs it. I will crawl under that overhang there. I will be fine. Send Luke back for me with a sled. It is the only way." Clara looked at the overhang he pointed to, a small shelter of rock. Then she looked at the white void ahead. "Go!" Elias roared. "Before the trail is gone completely." Clara stood up, tears freezing on her lashes. She looked at the injured man, then at the horse waiting nervously in the snow. She was terrified. She wanted to curl up and cry, but the thought of the child she had never met, pushed her forward. She scrambled back to the horse and mounted, her movements stiff. She looked back once. Elias waved her on, dragging himself toward the rocks. Clara turned the horse into the wind and kicked its flanks. She was alone. The world became a white blur of ridges and gullies. Clara had no idea if she was going the right direction. She simply kept the wind on her left cheek. As Elias had told her, she began to lose feeling in her hands completely. Her mind started to drift. She thought of the warm kitchen in her uncle's house. She thought of the fire in the saloon. She wondered if anyone would remember her name if she died out here. Clara Hart, the fallen woman, found frozen in a drift. Her horse stumbled, jolting her back to reality. They were in a deep gully now. The snow was up to the horse's chest. The animal was exhausted, its breathing ragged. "Come on," Clara whispered, her lips numb. "Please, just a little further." From the opposite direction, Luke Callahan was fighting a losing battle. Bess was done. The mare had fought the drifts for 2 hours, but the snow was too deep. Luke had dismounted, leading her by the reins, breaking the trail with his own body. He was exhausted. His lungs burned with every breath of icy air. He had not found the wagon. He had not found anything but endless white. He knew he had to turn back. If he went any further, he wouldn't have the strength to make it home to Annie. He paused, leaning against the horse's shoulder, gasping for air. Then he saw it. A shape, emerging from the swirling snow ahead. It was dark and lumpy, moving with a jerky, uneven rhythm. A rider. "Miller!" Luke shouted, his voice hoarse. He urged Bess forward. The figure came closer. It was a horse, head down, plodding blindly, and slumped in the saddle was a person. It wasn't Miller. Miller was a big man. This figure was small, slight. Luke reached the horse and grabbed the bridle. The animal halted, trembling. Luke looked up at the rider. It was a woman. She was coated in ice. Her hat was gone, her dark hair plastered to her skull with snow. Her face was the color of old paper, her lips blue. Her eyes were half open, rolling back in her head. She looked like a corpse that had been tied to the saddle. "Miss!" Luke shouted, shaking her leg. "Miss!" Clara's eyes focused on him for a second. They were glassy, confused. "Luke," she whispered, the word barely a breath. Suddenly, her horse shifted its weight, stepping into a soft pocket of snow. The animal lurched sideways. Clara, having no strength left to hold on, slid from the saddle like a sack of grain. Luke moved on instinct. He dropped his reins and lunged forward. He caught her before she hit the snow. His arm scooped her up, the impact driving the air from his lungs. She was light, terribly light, but dead weight in his arms. He staggered back, struggling to keep his footing in the drift, and pulled her tight against him. For a moment, the world stopped. The wind howled, the snow swirled, but all Luke was aware of was the woman in his arms. He could feel the cold radiating off her clothes, but underneath, where her body pressed against his chest, there was a faint, stubborn heat. He looked down at her face. It was a face he vaguely recognized from town, a face he had seen people turn away from. But here, in the savage emptiness of the storm, she was just a human being fighting to live. Her head lolled against his shoulder. Her breath hitched, a jagged, shallow sound against his neck. Luke felt a jolt go through him. It was a fierce, protective surge, primal and overwhelming. It was the same feeling he had when he looked at Annie. He pulled her closer, his gloved hands gripping her waist, trying to share his own warmth with her. For a second, their eyes met. Hers were brown, wide with terror and relief. His were blue, hard with determination. There was a spark, something that wasn't just survival. It was a recognition. Two lonely, broken people colliding in the middle of nowhere. Then practicality slammed back into him. She was freezing to death. He looked around. The visibility was dropping to zero. There was no way to get her back to town. Elias was gone. Luke assumed the second horse meant there had been another rider, but he couldn't search for him now. He had to save the woman. "We are going home," Luke shouted over the wind, though he didn't know if she could hear him. He dragged her toward Bess. It was a struggle to get her up. He had to lift her dead weight, shoving her into the saddle. She slumped forward, gripping the mane. Luke mounted behind her. He settled into the saddle and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her back against his chest. He enveloped her in his own coat as best he could, creating a cocoon of wool and body heat. He took the reins of her horse, leading it, and turned Bess around. "Hold on," he yelled into her ear. "Do not go to sleep." They began the slow, agonizing trek back. The ride was intimate in a way that felt forbidden. Luke could feel every shiver that racked her body. He could feel the curve of her spine against his chest. His arms were bracketed around her, his hands holding the reins in front of her stomach. Every time the horse lunged through a drift, he tightened his grip, holding her safe. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness. She knew she was being held. She felt the solid wall of a man's chest behind her, the rough wool of his sleeve against her cheek. It smelled of wood smoke and horses. It smelled of safety. She let her head fall back against his shoulder, surrendering to the strength that was keeping her upright. It took an hour to go 2 miles. The wind tried to push them off the earth. The snow tried to blind them. But Luke knew this land. He navigated by the slope of the ground and the direction of the wind. Finally, a dark shape materialized out of the white. The cabin. Luke felt a sob of relief catch in his throat. "We are here," he said, his voice cracking. "We are here." He rode right up to the porch. He slid off the back of the horse, his legs numb, and reached up to pull Clara down. She fell into his arms, unable to stand. He kicked the door. "Annie, open the door!" The latch lifted, and the door swung inward. Annie stood there, her eyes widening until they were perfect circles. She looked at her father, covered in ice, holding a strange woman who looked half dead. "Daddy," she squeaked. "Get back! Button!" Luke shouted, carrying Clara across the threshold. He kicked the door shut behind them, sealing out the roar of the storm. The silence of the cabin was sudden and shocking. Luke stood in the center of the room, breathing hard, the woman limp in his arms. Annie stared at them, clutching her wooden horse. Outside, the wind screamed, piling the snow higher against the walls. They were trapped, a widower, a fallen woman, and a sick child, locked together in a small wooden box at the end of the world. Luke lowered Clara Hart onto the only chair in the cabin, his movement stiff and awkward, like a man handling fine china with hands made for breaking stone. She was trembling so violently that her teeth chattered, a sharp, rhythmic sound that cut through the sudden quiet of the room. Annie stood by the stove, clutching her wooden horse against her chest, her eyes wide and round as saucers. She looked from her father, who was covered in a layer of snow that was rapidly melting into dark patches on his coat, to the woman who looked as if she had been dredged up from the bottom of a frozen river. "Annie," Luke said, his voice raspy from the cold air. "This is Miss Hart. She was caught in the storm. She will be staying with us until the weather breaks." Annie took a half-step forward, her curiosity warring with shyness. "Hello," she whispered. Clara looked up. Her face was as pale as the milk in the pitcher, her lips tinged with blue. She tried to smile, but her facial muscles were too frozen to obey. She managed to nod, wrapping her arms around her midsection. "Hello, Annie," she stammered, the words tripping over her chattering teeth. "Thank you for letting me in." Luke turned away abruptly, needing to move, needing to do something with the restless energy that the ride had whipped up in him. He began to strip off his heavy coat. We had no choice. Miss Hart. A dog would not survive a night out there, let alone a person. He moved to the stove, grabbing the iron kettle. "I will heat some water. You need to get those wet clothes off before the frost takes your toes." Clara looked around the room as the feeling began to return to her extremities in painful prickles. It was a small cabin, built of rough-hewn pine logs that had darkened with smoke and age. The walls were bare save for a few pegs holding tack and a calendar from the general store that was 2 years out of date. The floor was made of split planks, scrubbed clean but uneven. There were shelves lined with a few battered books and tin canisters, and a single window that rattled in its frame every time the wind shrieked outside. It was a poor place. Clara could see the poverty in the thinness of the curtains and the way the daylight showed through a crack in the door frame. And yet, as the heat from the stove began to reach her, she realized it felt warmer than the velvet-draped parlor of the brothel in Silver Creek. It felt warmer than the boarding house room with its expensive wallpaper. It smelled of sage, wood smoke, and the rabbit stew bubbling in the pot. It smelled of a life lived with difficulty, but without pretense. "Here," Luke said. He was standing in front of her. He had removed his coat and hat, revealing hair the color of dark oak that was plastered to his forehead with sweat and melted snow. He held out a hand for her coat. Clara stood up, her legs wobbling. She fumbled with the buttons of the oversized canvas duster Elias had lent her. Her fingers were useless, stiff claws that refused to work. Luke watched her struggle for a moment, then stepped closer. "Allow me," he said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. He reached out and undid the buttons with surprising dexterity. He peeled the wet canvas from her shoulders, then the sodden wool coat beneath it. As he pulled the sleeves down her arms, the fabric caught on her cuffs, dragging the sleeves of her dress up. Clara flinched, trying to yank her hands back, but she was too slow. For a second, the pale skin of her wrists was exposed to the firelight. There were bruises there, old ones, fading to a sickly yellow-green, and newer ones that were dark purple, the shape of fingers. They were the marks of a man who liked to grab hard when he was angry, the signature of Jericho, the man she had fled from weeks ago. Luke went still. He held the wet coat in one hand, his gaze fixed on her wrists. He did not say a word. He did not gasp or ask who had done it. But Clara saw his jaw tighten, a muscle jumping in his cheek. His eyes, which had been guarded and distant, suddenly softened with a profound, weary understanding. It was not pity. Exactly. It was the look of a man who knew what violence looked like and hated that he was seeing it on her. Clara snatched her hands back, pulling her sleeves down aggressively. She crossed her arms over her chest, her posture rigid. She waited for the question. She waited for him to ask what kind of woman got bruised like that. She waited for the judgment. But Luke simply turned away, walking to the pegs by the door to hang the wet garments. "The water is hot," he said, his back to her. "Annie, show Miss Hart where the basin is. I need to see to the horses." He grabbed his hat and went back out into the storm, closing the door firmly behind him. Clara let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She looked down at Annie, who was watching her with grave concern. "Are you broken?" Annie asked innocently. Clara managed a weak, genuine smile this time. "No, sweet girl, just a little bruised. But I will mend." That night, the storm raged with a renewed ferocity. The wind hammered against the cabin like a giant fist, shaking the rafters and making the lantern flame dance wildly in its glass chimney. They ate supper in relative silence. The stew was thin, mostly broth and potatoes with very little meat. But to Clara, it tasted like a feast. She ate slowly, conscious of every mouthful, aware that she was eating food that likely belonged to the child. When the meal was done and the dishes washed in the basin, the awkward business of sleep had to be addressed. The cabin had only one real bed, a sturdy frame in the corner piled with quilts. "You will take the bed, Miss Hart," Luke said. He was sitting in the rocking chair, oiling his rifle, the weapon dismantled on a cloth across his knees. "Oh, no," Clara protested immediately. "I cannot take your bed. The floor is fine. I have slept on worse." Luke did not look up from the gun mechanism. "You are a guest, and you nearly froze to death 3 hours ago. You take the bed. Annie has a pallet she likes near the stove." "But where will you sleep?" Clara asked. Luke reassembled the rifle with a sharp metallic click. "I will do just fine right here in the chair. I need to keep the fire fed anyway. If the stove goes out tonight, we will all be statues by morning." Annie tugged on Clara's skirt. "It is all right," she chirped. "My pallet is warm, and you can have my extra quilt, the one with the stars." Clara looked at the man and the girl. She realized there was no point in arguing. Luke Callahan was a man who had made up his mind, and his stubbornness was as solid as the logs of his walls. "Thank you," she said softly. The arrangements were made. Annie curled up on a pile of sheepskins and blankets near the stove, looking like a small, contented cat. Clara retreated to the bed in the corner, keeping her dress on but removing her boots. She slid under the heavy quilts, the mattress groaning softly under her weight. Luke blew out the lantern. The room plunged into darkness, save for the orange glow of the embers behind the stove grate. Clara lay still, listening to the wind scream. She turned her head slightly. In the dim light, she could see Luke's silhouette in the chair. He was sitting upright, his boots still on, his legs stretched out toward the heat. His head was turned toward the window, though there was nothing to see but blackness. He looked like a sentry keeping watch over a fortress under siege. His shoulders were hunched forward slightly, and even in repose, he held a tension that spoke of a man who expected the world to strike him. Clara watched him for a long time. She knew that look. It was the look of a man who was deeply, achingly alone. She wondered what he was thinking about as he stared into the dark. Was he thinking of the wife he had lost? Was he worrying about the snow piling up against the door? Or was he just enduring, minute by minute, the way she had learned to endure? She felt a strange kinship with him then, a connection that had nothing to do with words. They were both survivors, huddled together against a world that wanted to crush them. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, she slept without fear. The storm did not break the next day, nor the day after. For 2 days, the cabin was a ship adrift in a white ocean. The snow drifted halfway up the windows, turning the light inside to a perpetual, ghostly gray. They fell into a routine born of necessity. It was strained at first, filled with polite excuses and careful movements to avoid bumping into one another in the small space. But slowly, the tension began to thaw. Clara insisted on earning her keep. She was not a woman who sat idle. When Luke brought in a bucket of potatoes from the root cellar, she took the knife from his hand before he could protest. "I know how to peel a potato, Mr. Callahan," she said, sitting by the stove, "and I wager I can do it faster than you." Luke watched her for a moment, surprised. He had expected her to be useless, a town woman, a woman of the night who knew only silk and perfume. But her hands were capable. She wielded the knife with a rhythmic precision, the peels falling away in long, continuous ribbons. She took over the mending as well. She found a basket of Luke's shirts, torn at the shoulders and missing buttons. She sat by the window to catch the gray light, her needle flashing. "You do not have to do that," Luke grumbled on the second afternoon. Coming in from checking the stock, he looked uncomfortable seeing her handling his clothes, his personal things. Clara didn't look up. A man cannot work a ranch in a shirt that is falling off his back. "Besides, it gives my hands something to do." Luke stood by the door, stomping the snow from his boots. He watched her bite the thread and tie a knot. She was efficient. She was quiet. And she had a way with Annie that he hadn't expected. Annie was enchanted by the visitor. She followed Clara around the cabin like a shadow. Clara told her stories, sanitized, magical versions of the places she had been. She spoke of cities with buildings as tall as cliffs, of ladies who wore dresses the color of peacocks, of trains that roared like dragons. Luke listened from the corner while he whittled a new handle for his axe. He noticed that Clara never spoke of herself in these stories. She was always the observer, never the participant. She erased herself from the narrative, painting a world of wonder for his daughter while keeping her own scars hidden in the margins. There was a quiet humor to her, too. When the roof leaked, dripping icy water directly onto the table during lunch, Clara simply moved her bowl and said, "Fresh water is a luxury in some parts. I hear—" It made Annie giggle, and even Luke felt the corner of his mouth twitch. But beneath the domestic routine, there was a current running between them, a low, humming wire of awareness. It happened in small beats, moments that vanished as quickly as they arrived but left a scorch mark behind. On the second evening, they were both reaching for the coffee pot on the stove. Luke's hand moved left, Clara's moved right, and for a heartbeat, her sleeve brushed against his bare forearm where he had rolled up his cuff. They both froze. The contact was nothing, just wool against skin. But in the close, overheated air of the cabin, it felt like a lightning strike. Luke could feel the warmth of her arm through the fabric. He could smell the scent of her, soap and sage and something distinctly female that he hadn't smelled in this house for 7 years. He pulled his hand back as if he had been burned. "Sorry," he muttered, turning away to grab a rag. Clara stood still, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at his back, at the way the muscles tensed under his shirt. She felt a flush rise in her neck that had nothing to do with the stove. Later that night, as Clara sat by the fire combing out her hair, Luke looked up from his book. He had thought she was asleep. She had pulled the pins from her heavy dark hair, and it fell in a cascading wave over her shoulder, exposing the pale curve of her neck. It was an intimate sight, a private act of unbinding. Luke stared at the contrast of the dark hair against the white skin of her neck. He felt a sudden, sharp hunger in his gut. Not just a physical need, though that was there, undeniable and potent, but a longing for the intimacy of it. The longing to be the man who was allowed to see this. He looked away quickly, shame flooding him. He thought of Maggie, lying cold in the ground. I have no right, he told himself. I have no right to look at her like that. She is a stranger. She is a guest, but he could not unsee it. Clara, for her part, felt his gaze. She felt it on her hands when she sewed. She felt it on her profile when she read to Annie. It made her chest ache with a confusing mixture of fear and hope. She was used to men looking at her. She was used to the hungry, predatory stares of men in saloons, men who looked at her and saw a thing they could buy. Luke's gaze was different. It was heavy, yes, and intense, but it wasn't taking, it was wondering. It made her feel visible in a way that was terrifying. It made her want to lean toward him, to step into that gravity. On the third afternoon, the wind finally began to die down. The silence that followed was heavy. Annie dragged the box of old newspapers to the center of the room. We have to decorate the tree, she announced. It is almost Christmas Eve. Clara sat on the floor with her. She showed Annie how to cut the paper into strips and glue them into rings with a paste made of flour and water. Like this, Clara said, her fingers nimble and sure. You link them together. It is a chain. Luke sat in his chair, watching them. The firelight cast a golden glow over the scene, the woman and the child, heads bent together, making something beautiful out of trash. He heard Annie laugh, a bright, clear sound that seemed to chase the shadows out of the corners of the room. An unexpected warmth expanded in Luke's chest. It wasn't the searing heat of desire this time. It was a slow, steady burn of contentment. For years, this cabin had been a place of survival. Tonight, watching Clara help his daughter hang a paper star on a dead branch, it felt like a home. That evening, after Annie had fallen asleep, the air in the cabin shifted. The domestic bustle was gone, leaving only the two adults and the weight of their unsaid words. Luke poured 2 mugs of coffee and set one in front of Clara. She was sitting at the table, staring at her hands. She is a good girl, Clara said softly. Annie, you have done a fine job with her. Mr. Callahan. Luke sat opposite her, wrapping his hands around the warm ceramic mug. Luke, he corrected gently. You can call me Luke. And thank you. She is all I have. He looked into his coffee. Her mother, Maggie. She died the night Annie was born. It was a winter like this. Clara looked up, her eyes dark with sympathy. I am so sorry. Luke shrugged. A small, painful movement. I was young. I thought I could fight the weather. I thought I could save her. I learned that night that the prairie does not care what you want. It takes what it takes. He looked at Clara then, his eyes searching. And what about you, Clara? You are good with children. You have a gentle hand. You must have family somewhere. Clara stiffened. She pulled her hands into her lap, hiding them. No family. My mother died when I was small. My father, well, he was gone before that. She looked at the window, where the frost was beginning to melt. I have worked since I was 12, in factories, in kitchens, and other places. She hesitated, then spoke, her voice barely a whisper. I worked in a place where men never learned your real name. They did not want to know it. It was easier for them if you were just a face, a body. The silence that followed was thick. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She had said too much. She had dropped the veil. She waited for the disgust to register on his face. She waited for him to tell her to get out. Luke did not recoil. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the shame she was trying to hide, the defensive set of her shoulders. Names matter, Luke said quietly. You are Clara. That is what matters in this house. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. She looked down, blinking rapidly. She felt a profound sense of guilt wash over her. He was so good. He was so decent. If he knew the details, if he knew the things she had done, the things that had been done to her, he would not be sitting there. He would not be offering her coffee. He would see the stain on her soul. She felt safe here, in this small, rough cabin. And that safety felt like a lie she was telling him. That night, Luke lay awake in his chair for a long time. The fire had burned down to red coals. He could hear the soft, rhythmic breathing of the woman in the bed across the room. His mind was a battlefield. Part of him, the part that had died with Maggie, wanted to stay numb. It was safer to be numb. Loving something meant you could lose it. Desire was a trap. But another part of him, a part he had thought buried under 7 years of snow, was waking up. He wanted to cross the room. He wanted to sit on the edge of that bed and touch her hand. He wanted to hold her, not to save her from a storm, but just to feel the life in her. He clenched his hands into fists on the armrests of the chair, his knuckles turning white. "Stop it," he told himself. "She is leaving. She is broken, and you are broken, and two broken things do not make a whole." But as he listened to her breathe, he knew he was lying to himself. By morning, the wind had stopped completely. The sun rose over a world that was blindingly white and silent. The storm was over. Luke stood by the window, drinking his coffee. The sky was a pale, hard blue. It was time. "The roads will be impassable for a wagon," Luke said, his voice flat. "But a horse can make it now. The drifts have crusted over." Clara was folding the quilt she had slept under. She paused, her hands smoothing the fabric. "I should go. Then I have duties in town." She didn't have duties. She had a floor to scrub and a saloon keeper to beg for mercy. But she couldn't stay here. Every minute she stayed, the ache in her chest grew worse. Luke nodded. "I will saddle the horses." When it was time to leave, Annie clung to Clara's waist. The little girl buried her face in Clara's skirts, sobbing. "Do not go," Annie cried. "Please do not go. You can stay. Daddy, tell her she can stay." Luke stood by the door, holding Clara's coat. He looked at his daughter, then at Clara. His eyes were full of a helpless pain. "Annie, hush now," Clara said, kneeling down. She cupped the girl's face in her hands. "I have to go back to town, but listen, I will visit. I promise. If I can find work nearby, I will come and see you." "You promise?" Annie sniffled. "I cross my heart," Clara said, making the motion over her chest. She stood up and took her coat from Luke. Their fingers brushed again, and this time, neither of them pulled away immediately. They stood there for a second, connected by the wool coat, looking at each other. "Thank you," Clara whispered. "For everything." Luke cleared his throat. "I will ride you back. It is still dangerous in the drifts." They rode out into the blinding white day side by side. The air was crisp and cold, sharp in their lungs. The snow stretched out in every direction, unbroken and pristine. They did not speak much. There was no need. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was heavy with things that could not be said. Luke watched her out of the corner of his eye. She sat the horse better now, her back straight, her profile etched against the blue sky. He felt a pang of loss so sharp it nearly doubled him over. He was taking her back to a world that despised her. He was taking her back to a rented room above a saloon, and he was going back to a silence that would be louder than before. As their horses plodded through the snow, their knees occasionally bumping, both Luke and Clara felt the terrifying, fragile truth settling over them. Something had started in that cabin. Something forbidden, something that had no place in the harsh reality of Red Willow. But as they rode toward the town that waited like a judge on the horizon, neither of them could bring themselves to wish it away. Red Willow was a town built on timber, nails, and judgment. As the snow from the great storm settled into a hard, dirty crust along the main street, the silence that had gripped the town during the blizzard was replaced by a low, buzzing hum. It was the sound of whispers, passing from the mercantile to the church steps, and from the livery stable to the parlor rooms. Luke Callahan had brought the strange woman back. That was the seed, and it sprouted quickly in the fertile soil of boredom and self-righteousness. They had ridden in together, the widower and the drifter, thigh to thigh on a single horse, looking exhausted and disheveled. To the men in the saloon, it was a joke. A ribald nudge in the ribs about the quiet rancher finally finding some warmth in the winter. To the women of the Ladies' Aid Society, it was a scandal that tasted of vinegar and delighted shock. Luke felt the weight of their eyes the moment he stepped into the general store 3 days after the roads cleared. He had left Annie in the wagon, wrapped in buffalo robes, terrified to let her hear what people might be saying. He walked to the counter, placing his list on the wood: a sack of flour, coffee, a tin of kerosene. Mr. Henderson, the shopkeeper, took the list without his usual chatter about the weather. He kept his eyes on the ledger, his movements stiff. "Is that all? Callahan?" Henderson asked, his voice tight. "That is all," Luke said. As he waited, the bell above the door jingled. The air in the store seemed to drop 10 degrees. Luke did not need to turn around to know who it was, but he did anyway. Mrs. Ralston stood there, shaking snow from her velvet cloak. She was the wife of the preacher, a woman who wore her piety like a suit of armor, impenetrable and cold. She spotted Luke immediately. Her lips pursed, then stretched into a thin, joyless smile. "Mr. Callahan," she said, gliding forward. "We were so worried about you during the storm. And little Annie, we are fine, Mrs. Ralston," Luke said, tipping his hat. "We made out all right. We heard you had company," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried easily to the back of the store. "A woman, a Miss Hart, I believe." Luke stiffened. Miss Hart was stranded on the trail. She helped a man who was thrown from his horse. I brought her to my cabin because she would have died otherwise. "Of course, Mrs. Ralston said, patting his arm with a gloved hand. "Christian charity. We all understand that, but one must be careful. Luke, people talk, and a man in your position, a man raising a motherless girl. Well, your example is paramount." "My example?" Luke asked, his voice low and dangerous. "You must consider who you allow around the child," she continued, her eyes hard as agates. "Certain women carry a stain. Mr. Callahan, it rubs off. We would hate to see Annie's innocence compromised by inappropriate influences." Luke looked at her. He saw the gleam of malice in her eyes, the thrill of holding power over someone else's reputation. He thought of Clara peeling potatoes by his fire. He thought of the way she had mended his shirt and held Annie when the fever spiked. "Miss Hart risked her life to bring medicine to my daughter," Luke said, his voice ringing clearly through the silent store. "She showed more courage and decency in one night than most people in this town show in a lifetime. If that is a stain, Mrs. Ralston, then I reckon we could all use a little more of it." He grabbed his supplies from the counter, ignoring Henderson's shocked expression, and walked out. Mrs. Ralston stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, the insult hanging in the air like smoke, while Luke fought his battles in the store. Clara was fighting her own war on the other side of town. She had left the saloon. O'Malley had made it clear that her debt was paid, but her welcome was expired unless she wanted to start entertaining the guests upstairs. Clara had packed her bag and walked out into the cold morning. She went to the dressmaker's shop. The woman looked at her hands, saw the calluses, and shook her head. She went to the laundry. They told her they were full. She went to the hotel, offering to change sheets. The clerk laughed. By noon, she was standing in the alley behind the Bluebird Cafe, shivering in her thin coat. The smell of frying bacon and coffee wafted out, making her stomach cramp with hunger. She had 70 cents to her name. The back door opened, and a man stepped out to dump a bucket of dishwater into the snow. He was older, balding, with a stained apron tied over a paunch. This was Silas Higgins, a man known for being cheap, but not particularly cruel. He looked at Clara, then at the bucket, then back at Clara. "You look like a stray cat," he grunted. "I'm looking for work, Mr. Higgins." Clara said, "I can cook. I can wait tables. I can scrub this alley if you want." Higgins wiped his hands on his apron. "I heard about you. You are the one who rode out to Callahan's." "Yes, people say you're trouble. People say a lot of things," Clara said, holding his gaze. "I'm asking for a chance to work. Honest work. I will take whatever wage you offer, and I will be the hardest worker you have ever had." Higgins chewed on his lip. "My morning girl quit. Ran off with a drummer selling patent medicine. I need someone for the breakfast rush and the lunch stew. But listen to me, Miss Hart. This is a respectable establishment. I catch you making eyes at the customers, or I hear one word about you carrying on. You are out. No second chances. I understand." Clara said $2 a week and 1 meal a day. It was a starvation wage. It was barely enough to pay for a cot in the attic of the boarding house. If Mrs. Abel would even take her back. But it was honest. "I will take it," Clara said. The weeks that followed were a grind of grease, steam, and aching feet. Clara was at the cafe before dawn, lighting the stove and chopping onions until her eyes watered. She served coffee to men who stared at her chest, and she ignored their comments with a practiced deftness. She washed dishes until her hands were red and chapped. But she was off the street, and she was staying. Luke began to come into town more often. Before the storm, he had come once a month. Now, he was there every Tuesday and Friday. He told himself it was for supplies. He told himself he needed nails, or salt, or a new hinge for the barn door. But the wagon always ended up parked near the Bluebird Cafe. Annie was the excuse, and she was a willing conspirator. "Daddy, can we see Miss Clara? Can we?" she would beg as soon as they hit the town limits. Luke would pretend to consider it. "I suppose we could stop for a moment." They would go to the back door, away from the prying eyes in the dining room. Clara would come out, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face flushed from the heat of the kitchen. The transformation in her when she saw them was immediate. The guarded, weary look she wore for the customers vanished, replaced by a smile that lit up the gloomy alley. "Hello, Button," she would say, crouching down to hug Annie. They would stand there for 10 minutes, sometimes 15. Luke would lean against the rough brick wall, watching them. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. Just seeing her was enough to settle the restlessness that plagued him out on the ranch. One Tuesday, Clara brought out a bundle wrapped in a checkered cloth. "I made this for you," she said, handing it to Luke. "It is fresh bread. I put a little cinnamon in the dough for Annie." Luke took the warm bundle. His fingers brushed hers. The contact was brief, but he felt it all the way to his shoulder. "Thank you. Clara, you do not have to do this. I want to," she said simply. The bond between them grew in these stolen moments, built on small, silent acts of service. A week later, Luke noticed that the wooden step leading to the cafe's back door was rotted through. Clara had stumbled on it twice while bringing out the trash. The next time he came to town, he brought his tool belt. He waited until the lunch rush was at its peak and Clara was busy inside. He knelt in the slush of the alley, pried up the rotten board, and nailed down a piece of sturdy oak he had cut from his own stock. He worked quickly, efficiently, and left before she came out again. When Clara opened the door that evening to throw out the grounds, her boot landed on solid wood. She looked down, seeing the fresh, pale timber. She looked out at the empty alley, her heart swelling with a tenderness she hadn't felt in years. It was a small thing, a piece of wood, but to her, it was a love letter nailed to the earth. She returned the favor in the only way she could. She noticed Annie's mittens were unraveling at the thumbs. "Give them here. Annie," she said one afternoon, "let me fix that." She took the mittens home to her tiny room. She didn't just darn the holes. She used a scrap of pink yarn she had saved and embroidered tiny, delicate flowers around the cuffs. When she gave them back, Annie squealed with delight. Luke took one of the mittens in his large, calloused hand. He looked at the tiny stitches, precise and careful. He imagined Clara sitting in her cold room, working by the light of a tallow candle, thinking of his daughter. He looked at Clara, his eyes dark and intense. "You have magic in your hands." "Clara." Clara blushed, looking away. "It is just a bit of yarn." "Luke, it is more than that," he said. "And we both know it." One evening in late January, Luke stayed in town later than usual. Annie was asleep in the back of the wagon, buried under furs. He had finished his business, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. He waited in the alley until Clara finished her shift. When she came out, wrapping her shawl tight against the biting wind, she stopped, surprised to see him standing there in the shadows. "Luke, is everything all right?" "I thought I would walk you home," he said, feeling foolish. "It is icy tonight." Clara smiled, a soft, tired expression. "I would like that." They walked side by side down the narrow boardwalks, the snow crunching under their boots. The town was quiet, the windows dark save for the saloon. "It gets lonely out there," Luke said suddenly, breaking the silence. "At the ranch, sometimes the silence is so loud I can hear my own blood moving." "I know," Clara said. "It is lonely here, too. You can be lonely in a room full of people, maybe even lonelier." They turned down the alley that led to her boarding house. It was a tunnel of wind and shadow. "I feel like an outsider," Luke confessed. "Like I'm watching the world through a pane of glass. I see them in the store, in the church, and I know I do not belong to them." "You do not want to belong to them." "Luke," Clara said fiercely, "they are hard people. They have forgotten how to be kind." "I do not care about them," Luke said. "I care about—" He stopped. They were walking over a patch of slick ice near a rain barrel. Clara's boot heel skidded. She gasped, flailing, her weight pitching backward. Luke moved with the reflexes of a man used to catching falling things. His hand shot out, grabbing her gloved hand, while his other arm swept around her waist to steady her. He pulled her upright, but he didn't let go. They stood there in the freezing alley, chest to chest. His hand was still gripping hers, their fingers interlaced. It wasn't a polite grip. It was tight, desperate. Clara looked up at him. The moon was bright enough to show the steam rising from their skin. She saw the conflict in his face, the rigid control warring with a raw, terrifying hunger. She felt it too, a desire that started in her belly and radiated outward, making her knees weak. It wasn't just that she wanted him to kiss her. She wanted him to claim her. She wanted to be held by someone who saw her as precious, not purchasable. For 10 seconds, the world narrowed down to the heat of his hand in hers and the sound of their ragged breathing. Luke leaned in, just an inch. Clara's lips parted. Then, abruptly, Luke ripped his hand away. He stepped back as if he had been shocked. I am sorry," he stammered, his voice rough. "I should not have—" "The ice. I was just catching you." Clara felt the loss of his touch like a physical blow. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. "Of course. Thank you. Luke, I have to get back. Annie is waiting." He turned and walked away fast, almost running. He hated himself. He hated the cowardice that made him run, and he hated the desire that made him want to stay. He was a man walking a tightrope over a canyon, and the wind was picking up. But the wind in Red Willow had a name, and that name was Ephraim Pike. Pike was a man who owned the valley, or at least enough of it that the rest didn't matter. He was 50 years old, heavy-set, with a face like a slab of cured ham and eyes that were small and shrewd. He dressed in fine wool suits and smoked cigars that cost more than a ranch hand made in a month. He had been eyeing Luke's homestead for 3 years. It was a small parcel, but it controlled the water rights to the creek that Pike wanted for his own herds. He had offered to buy it. Luke had refused. He had threatened. Luke had ignored him. Now, Pike had found a new lever. He was sitting in the corner of the Bluebird Cafe one afternoon, eating a steak, when Clara came out of the kitchen to refill coffee cups. Pike paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. He watched her move across the room. He narrowed his eyes. He knew that walk. He knew the tilt of that head. He didn't know her from Red Willow. He knew her from a trip he had taken to Silver Creek a year ago. A discreet trip. A trip involving whiskey and women who did what they were told. When Clara came to his table to pour the coffee, Pike reached out and grabbed her wrist. "Well now," he said, his voice oily, "if it isn't little Clara, you are a long way from Jericho's place." "Girl." Clara froze. The pot shook in her hand, coffee sloshing onto the saucer. She looked down at him, and the blood drained from her face. She recognized him. The smell of expensive tobacco and cruelty. "Let go of me," she whispered. Pike smiled, showing yellowed teeth. He did not let go. "I hardly recognized you in that apron. Very demure." "Playing the good girl now? Please," Clara said, panic rising in her throat. "Please do not. I am just working. Does your boss know where you earned your trade?" Pike asked softly. "Does the town know? Does that widower know?" Clara felt the room spin. If he spoke, it was over. The job, the room, the fragile respect she was trying to build, all of it would vanish. "What do you want?" she asked. Pike released her wrist. "I want you to be reasonable. Clara, I am a lonely man, much like our friend Mr. Callahan. I appreciate old courtesies. You come see me at the ranch. Maybe we can work something out. You make me happy." I keep my mouth shut. He picked up his fork and pointed it at her. "Do not make me ask twice." Clara retreated to the kitchen, her heart hammering like a trapped bird. She leaned against the counter, gasping for air. She was trapped. If she refused him, he would destroy her. If she agreed, she would destroy herself. Winter did not let up. February brought wet, heavy snows and a damp cold that settled in the lungs. Annie began to cough again. It started as a tickle, then became a deep, hacking sound that kept Luke awake all night. Her fever returned, spiking high in the evenings. Luke was terrified. He paced the cabin floor, listening to her wheeze. He used the last of the tonic. He made poultices of mustard and onion. Nothing helped. He needed the strong medicine from the doctor in the city, the stuff that cost $5 a bottle. He didn't have $5. He had spent his last coin on feed for the cattle, gambling that the weather would break. He rode into town, his face gray with exhaustion, his eyes rimmed with red. He went to the bank to ask for a loan. Rejected, he went to the mercantile to ask for credit. Henderson refused, citing the outstanding bill. He walked to the alley behind the cafe. He didn't even have the strength to knock. He just leaned against the brick wall, staring at the gray sky, looking like a man who had finally been broken. Clara came out with the trash. She saw him and dropped the bucket. "Luke, my God, what is it?" She ran to him. He looked at her, and his face crumpled. "It is Annie," he choked out. "The cough is back. It is bad. Clara, worse than before. I need the medicine, but I'm tapped out. I have nothing left to sell." Clara didn't hesitate. She reached into the pocket of her apron. She pulled out a small, knotted handkerchief. Inside were her wages from the last month, every cent she had saved to buy a warmer coat, to maybe one day buy a train ticket. She grabbed Luke's hand and pressed the knot of coins into his palm. "Take it," she said. Luke looked at the money, then at her. "No." "Clara, I cannot. This is everything you have." "It is not everything," she said fiercely. "Annie is everything. Take it, please. Do not let pride kill her. Luke." Luke looked at the coins, then at her face. He saw the desperation and the love shining there, unmasked and raw. His pride shattered. He nodded, closing his fingers over the money. "Thank you," he whispered. "Come inside," she said. "Just for a minute. You're freezing." She pulled him into the small storage room at the back of the kitchen. It was warm there, smelling of flour and yeast. It was private. Luke leaned back against the shelves, the adrenaline fading, leaving him shaking. Clara stood in front of him. She reached up and touched his cheek. Her thumb brushed over the rough stubble of his jaw. "You look so tired," she whispered. Luke closed his eyes at her touch. It was the only comfort he had felt in weeks. He turned his face into her palm, kissing the center of her hand. "I do not know what I would do without you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was drowning. Clara, and you keep pulling me up." He opened his eyes. They were inches apart. The air between them suddenly grew heavy, charged with the same electricity that had been in the alley, but deeper now. It wasn't just desire. It was gratitude. It was shared fear. It was love, terrified and desperate. Luke raised his hand and covered hers, pressing it against his face. He looked at her mouth. He wanted to kiss her more than he wanted his next breath. He leaned in, his body swaying toward her like iron to a magnet. Clara tilted her head back, her lips parting, her eyes fluttering shut. She wanted this. She wanted to forget Pike, forget the town, forget the past. The door to the kitchen banged open. "Clara, where are those onions?" It was Higgins. Luke and Clara sprang apart as if a bomb had gone off. Clara spun around, grabbing a sack of flour. Luke straightened, pulling his hat low to hide his face. Higgins stood in the doorway, eyeing them suspiciously. "What is going on here? Just getting supplies." "Mr. Higgins," Clara said, her voice trembling. "Mr. Callahan was just leaving." Luke walked past Higgins, head down. "I am going," he muttered. He stepped out into the cold alley, his heart pounding against his ribs like a hammer. He clutched the money in his pocket. He had the medicine, but he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he had almost crossed a line that he could never uncross. But eyes were everywhere. Pike had seen Luke enter the alley. He had seen him leave. He put the pieces together. The widower, the whore, the money changing hands. It was perfect. He started the rumors the next day. He didn't shout them. He whispered them to the right people. He told Henderson that he had seen Clara giving money to Luke, money she'd likely earned on her back. He told Mrs. Ralston that Luke was spending hours in the back of the cafe while his child lay sick at home. He twisted the narrative. It wasn't love. It was corruption. It was a fallen woman dragging a decent man down into the filth. The town, primed by prejudice, drank it up. The atmosphere in Red Willow changed from cold to hostile. People crossed the street to avoid Luke. Men spat when Clara walked by. The pressure was building, like steam in a capped boiler. Luke rode home with the medicine, his heart heavy. He gave Annie the dose, watching her sleep. He sat by the fire, looking at the coins remaining in his hand. Clara's sacrifice. He loved her. He knew it now. But as the wind howled outside and the town's judgment closed in like a pack of wolves, he wondered if his love was a gift, or if it was the very thing that would destroy them all. The iron-gray grip of winter tightened around the valley of Red Willow. It was March, a month that should have promised the thaw, but instead brought a bitterness that cracked stones and froze the sap in the cottonwoods. The snow did not melt. It merely compacted into layers of treacherous ice, hiding the earth beneath a shroud that felt permanent. Luke Callahan stood by his fence line, watching a black carriage cut a jagged line through the white expanse of the road. He knew the carriage. It belonged to Ephraim Pike. It was a vehicle of dark leather and polished wood, drawn by two heavy draft horses that steamed in the frigid air. The carriage pulled up to the gate. Pike climbed down, wrapped in a coat of fine beaver fur that cost more than Luke's entire herd. He walked to the fence, his boots crunching loudly on the crust. "Good morning, Callahan," Pike said, his breath puffing like dragon smoke. "A hard winter, isn't it?" Luke did not take off his glove to shake hands. He leaned on the fence post, his face set like granite. "What do you want, Pike?" Pike smiled, a gesture that did not reach his small, bead-like eyes. "I am a neighbor. Luke, I am just checking in. I see your hay is running low. Those cattle look like they might not make it to April." "My cattle are fine," Luke said, though he knew it was a lie. The hayloft was dangerously empty. Pike took a cigar from his pocket, bit the end off, and spat it into the snow. "You are a stubborn man. I admire that. But stubbornness does not feed a child. I'm here to make you that offer again. $500 for the land. It is a generous price. You could take the girl, move south, somewhere warm. Arizona, maybe." "The land is not for sale," Luke said, his voice low. Pike lit the cigar, the sulfur match flaring briefly. He took a long drag, exhaling a blue cloud. "You know, people are talking. They are concerned about you, about the girl. It is a hard thing for a man to raise a daughter alone, especially when his judgment seems to be clouded." Luke straightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Speak plain. Pike." Pike looked at him, the mask of neighborly concern slipping to reveal the shark beneath. "I am talking about the company you keep. Callahan, that woman, the one scrubbing floors at the cafe, the one who used to work in a house of ill repute in Silver Creek." Luke felt a roar of blood in his ears. "You keep her name out of your mouth." Pike chuckled darkly. "Oh, I know her name. I know her very well. And so does the town. They are wondering what kind of father exposes his innocent daughter to a woman like that, a woman who sells herself by the hour. That is a lie," Luke snarled, stepping forward. "Is it?" Pike asked, unflinching. "Or is it just a truth you do not want to look at? Listen to me. Luke, if you do not sell, things will get difficult. The bank holds your note. I sit on the board of the bank. And the county judge? He is a cousin of mine. If questions were raised about Annie's welfare, about the moral environment of her home, the court might decide she would be better off in an orphanage, or with a foster family." The threat hit Luke like a physical blow to the stomach. The cold air suddenly felt thin, impossible to breathe. "You wouldn't," Luke whispered. Pike turned back to his carriage. "Be reasonable. Luke, sell the land, save yourself the heartache. You have until the thaw to decide." Luke watched him drive away, the black carriage disappearing into the white void. He stood there until his feet were numb, shaking with a rage so potent it made him nauseous. He looked back at the cabin, where Annie was coughing, and felt the walls of his life closing in. In town, the walls were closing in on Clara as well. She had finished her shift at the Bluebird Cafe and was walking down Main Street, heading to the general store to buy a spool of thread. The wind was biting, whipping her skirts around her ankles, but the cold was nothing compared to the chill she felt when she saw Mrs. Ralston standing on the boardwalk. The preacher's wife was not alone. She was flanked by 3 other women from the church committee, the moral guardians of Red Willow. They stood in a phalanx, blocking the entrance to the store. Clara kept her head down, intending to step around them into the street. "Miss Hart, Mrs." Ralston's voice was sharp, like a whip crack. Clara stopped. She looked up, clutching her shawl tighter. "Mrs. Ralston, we need to have a word with you," the woman said. She did not look at Clara's face. She looked at a spot somewhere above Clara's head, as if making eye contact would be contaminating. "I am in a hurry," Clara said quietly. "It will only take a moment." "Mrs." Ralston said, "we have been praying on this, and we feel it is our Christian duty to speak to you. About Mr. Callahan." Clara felt her stomach drop. "What about him? You are ruining him." "Mrs." Ralston said plainly, "you are a snare. Miss Hart, a temptation. A man like that, grieving and lonely. He is vulnerable, and you are taking advantage of his weakness to worm your way into a respectable home." "I care about him," Clara said, her voice trembling. "And I care about Annie." "Care?" one of the other women scoffed. "A woman like you does not know the meaning of the word. You know only use. You are staining that child just by being near her." "Mrs." Ralston took a step forward. "If you truly cared for them, if there was one shred of decency left in you, you would leave. You would go away and let them find a decent, God-fearing woman to be a mother to that girl. Every day you stay, you drag them further down into the mud with you." Clara looked at their faces. Hard, self-righteous, unyielding. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell them about the nights she had spent holding Annie's hand while the fever burned. She wanted to tell them about the kindness in Luke's eyes. But the words died in her throat, because a voice inside her, the voice of her father, the voice of Jericho, the voice of every man who had ever left a bruise on her skin, whispered that they were right. She was damaged goods. She was dirty. How could she possibly be what Luke needed? I have to go," Clara stammered. She stepped off the boardwalk into the slush and walked away fast, her head bowed, tears freezing on her cheeks before they could fall. That evening, the snow began to fall again, big, heavy flakes that spiraled down in the silence. The town was asleep, shuddered against the cold. Luke stood in the alley behind the cafe. He had told Annie he was checking the wagon wheel, but he had come here. He needed to see her. He needed to know that there was something in the world that wasn't cruel and mercenary. The back door opened, and Clara slipped out. She looked exhausted. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale. "Luke," she whispered, "you shouldn't be here. People will see. I do not care who sees," Luke said, his voice rough. He stepped closer to her. The snow was dusting his hat and shoulders. He looked wild, his eyes burning with a desperate intensity. "Pike came to the ranch," Luke said. "He threatened to take Annie. He said I'm unfit because I know you." Clara let out a small, strangled sound. She covered her mouth with her hand. "Oh, God, I knew it. They were right." "Who was right?" "Mrs. Ralston. The women in town. They stopped me today. They told me I'm a poison to you. They said I'm destroying your life." Luke grabbed her shoulders. "They are liars. Clara, they are hypocrites with hearts like stone." "No." "Luke," Clara sobbed, trying to pull away. "They are not lying about what I am. You know what I am. I am exactly what they say. I have been used. Luke, I am not clean. I am not the kind of woman a man like you brings home to his daughter." She struggled against his grip, panic rising in her chest. "I have to leave. I have to go before Pike takes her away from you. Let me go. Luke." She turned, trying to run back toward the door. "No!" Luke roared. He caught her wrist, spinning her around. He pulled her into the shadows of the doorway, out of the wind, and slammed her body against his. He didn't think, he didn't plan. He just reacted to the terrifying thought of her leaving, of the silence returning to his life. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was frantic and hungry and terrified. His mouth crushed hers, stealing the breath from her lungs. His hands, usually so careful, trembled violently on her waist, gripping the fabric of her coat as if he were holding onto the edge of a cliff. Clara gasped against his mouth, her resistance shattering in an instant. She clutched the lapels of his rough wool coat, pulling him closer. She tasted the salt of her own tears and the cold of the snow melting on his face. For years, men had touched her. They had touched her with greed, with entitlement, with violence. They had taken from her body as if it were a resource to be mined. This was different. Luke wasn't taking. He was asking. He was begging. He was pouring his own loneliness into her and asking her to hold it. He was cherishing her. The realization broke her heart wide open. They stood there in the freezing alley, clinging to each other, their bodies pressed together from knee to chest. Luke groaned low in his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated need. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling the scent of her skin, his breath hot against the cold air. "Clara," he whispered into her hair. "Clara, do not say you are poison. You are the only air I have been able to breathe for months." They pulled apart slowly, both of them breathing hard, steam billowing between their faces. Clara looked up at him, her eyes wide and dark. She saw the raw vulnerability in his face, the defenses stripped away. "We cannot," she whispered, though she didn't move away. "It will ruin you." "I do not care," Luke said fiercely. "I want you. I want you at the ranch. I want you with Annie. I want you with me." "You do not know what you are asking," she said. "I know exactly what I am asking." 2 nights later, the inevitable happened. Annie's cough turned into a frightening rasp that sounded like tearing paper. She woke in the night, crying, her skin burning hot. Luke, in a panic, rode to town in the teeth of a rising blizzard to get Clara. He didn't care about the gossip. He needed her help. Clara rode back with him, huddled behind him on the horse, the snow stinging their faces. They spent the night in the cabin, fighting the fever. It was a siege. The wind howled like a banshee, shaking the door in its frame. The fire roared in the stove, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Together, they sponged Annie's forehead. They spooned broth into her mouth. They murmured soft words until the little girl's breathing finally eased and she fell into a fitful sleep. The adrenaline faded, leaving them both exhausted and raw. The cabin was warm. A small island of life in the white ocean. Luke sat on the floor by the stove, leaning back against the wood box. Clara sat beside him, her shoulder pressing against his. Luke looked at his hands, stained with soot and labor. "I failed her," he said quietly. "Maggie?" Clara turned to him. "Luke, no, I did. He insisted," his voice cracking. "She begged me not to go for the doctor. She was scared. She wanted me to stay and hold her, but I thought I could beat the storm. I left her alone to die. Clara, I left her alone in the dark." He put his head in his hands, and his shoulders began to shake. A single, harsh sob escaped him, a sound of 7 years of accumulated grief breaking loose. Clara didn't offer platitudes. She didn't tell him it wasn't his fault. She simply reached out and pulled him into her arms. She held his head against her breast, rocking him gently. She held him as if he were something precious, something fragile that deserved to be protected. He wept into her shoulder, the damp wool soaking up his tears. It was a surrender. He was letting her see the weakness he hid from the world. When he finally quieted, he didn't pull away. He stayed there, resting against her. Clara ran her fingers through his hair. "I have scars too. Luke," she whispered. She told him then. She told him about the first man who had promised her marriage and sold her instead. She told him about the brothel in Silver Creek, about the silk dresses that felt like shrouds, about the way she learned to detach her mind from her body so she wouldn't scream. She spoke the words into the dark, expecting him to stiffen, expecting him to pull away in disgust now that the ugly details were laid bare. But Luke didn't move. He listened to every word, his breathing steady. When she finished, silence filled the room, heavy and waiting. Luke sat up slowly. He turned to face her. In the firelight, his face was grave, but his eyes were clear. He reached out and cupped her face in his large, rough hands. His thumbs traced the line of her cheekbones, the curve of her jaw. He looked at her not as a fallen woman, not as a victim, but as a miracle. He saw the strength it took to survive that. He saw the capacity for love she had kept safe despite everything. "You are here," he said softly. "You are still here, and you are beautiful." He kissed her then, not like in the alley. This kiss was slow. It was a seal. It was a promise. They moved together onto the pallet of furs on the floor, the fire crackling beside them. Outside, the blizzard raged, trying to tear the world apart. Inside, under the worn quilts, they found a profound and terrifying peace. They touched each other with reverence, tracing scars, his on his heart, hers on her soul, and finding that they fit together. It was an act of defiance. It was two broken people deciding that they deserved to be whole. In the days that followed, the change in the cabin was palpable. The air felt lighter. Annie sensed it. She watched them with bright, knowing eyes. She saw the way Luke's hand lingered on Clara's shoulder when he poured her coffee. She saw the way Clara smiled when Luke came in from the cold. A real smile, one that reached her eyes. Annie stopped calling her Miss Hart. She started calling her Miss Clara, and then, simply, Clara. She would hold Clara's hand at the dinner table, linking the three of them into a circle. But the world outside the cabin was not so forgiving. The storm cleared, and the road to town opened, and with the open road came the reckoning. Pike made his move. He didn't come to the ranch this time. He went to the sheriff. He filed a formal complaint, citing concerns about the moral endangerment of a minor. He rallied the church committee, Mrs. Ralston began circulating a petition demanding that protective services intervene for the sake of the child. The pressure arrived in the form of a summons, delivered by a reluctant deputy. Luke had to appear before the county judge in 2 weeks to answer questions about his household. And then Pike came for Clara. He found her alone on the road, walking back to town to work her shift. He pulled his horse up alongside her, blocking her path. "Get in the buggy." "Clara," he said. "I will walk," she said, clutching her bag. "Get in, or I ride to the sheriff right now and tell him about the time you stole a gold watch from a client in Silver Creek." A lie, of course. But who will they believe? Me or the whore? Clara got in. Pike drove her to a secluded spot overlooking the valley. He pointed down at Luke's homestead, a small speck of smoke rising from the chimney. "Look at it," he said. "It is pathetic, but it is all he has, and you are going to cost him everything." "What do you want?" Clara asked, her voice dead. "I want you gone," Pike said. "I want you to leave Red Willow, tonight. If you stay, I will make sure the judge takes that girl. I have the papers drawn up. I have the debts called in. I will crush him. Clara, I will put him in prison for debt, and I will put that girl in an orphanage where she will be scrubbed raw until she forgets his name." Clara felt the blood drain from her body. "You are a monster." "I am a businessman," Pike said, "and I get what I want. So here is the deal. You leave, you vanish, you go back to the gutter where you belong, and I will let him keep the land. I will let him keep the girl." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a roll of bills. $50. Enough for a train ticket to San Francisco. "Take it. Save them." Clara looked at the money. Then she looked at the distant cabin. She knew Pike wasn't bluffing. He had the power. He had the money. If she stayed, her love would be the weapon that destroyed Luke's life. "I will go," she whispered. "Good," Pike said, thrusting the money into her hand. "Do not say goodbye. It is cleaner if you just disappear. Make him hate you. It will be easier for him." Clara walked back to the homestead in a daze. Luke was out on the range, checking the herd. Annie was napping. She moved like a ghost. She packed her few belongings into her carpet bag. Every movement was agony. Every object she touched, the coffee pot, the mended shirt, the paper star on the tree, screamed at her to stay. But she couldn't. She loved them too much to stay. She sat at the rough pine table and pulled a piece of paper from Luke's ledger. Her hand shook so badly the ink blotted. "Luke, I cannot stay. You were right to be afraid of the town. They are right about me. I am too stained for this life. I thought I could change, but I can't. You deserve better. Annie deserves a mother who doesn't have a past like mine. Forget me. Find someone worthy. Clara." She left the letter on the table, weighed down by the wooden horse Luke had carved. She kissed the top of Annie's sleeping head, choking back a sob that threatened to tear her throat out. Then she walked out the door. The sun was setting, casting long, blood-red shadows across the snow. The wind was picking up again, a cold front moving in from the north. Clara began to walk toward the main road, toward the darkness, away from the only light she had ever known. Luke rode in at dusk. He was tired, but his heart was light. He was planning to ask Clara to marry him. He didn't care about the judge. He didn't care about Pike. They would fight it together. He swung down from the saddle and walked into the cabin. "Daddy!" Annie was standing by the table, her face wet with tears. She was holding a piece of paper. "What is it?" "Button," Luke asked, a cold dread seizing his chest. "She is gone," Annie wailed. "Clara is gone." Luke snatched the paper from her hand. He read the words, "I am too stained. Forget me." The world tilted. The rage that filled him was not at Clara. It was at the lie she had written. He knew she didn't believe it. He knew she had been driven away. He smelled Pike's stench on this as surely as if the man were standing in the room. He crumpled the letter in his fist. For a moment, the pain was blinding. He sank into a chair, putting his head in his hands. It would be so easy to let her go, to let her save him, to go back to being the quiet widower, safe and alone. But then he looked at Annie. She was sobbing, clutching the mitten Clara had embroidered. He looked at the empty cabin. It felt dead without her. Luke stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. "No," he said. He grabbed his coat. He grabbed his rifle. He grabbed the box of shells. "Daddy?" Annie sniffled. "Get your coat." "Annie," Luke said, his voice hard as iron. "Where are we going?" "We are going to find her," Luke said. "We are going to find your mother, and God help anyone who tries to stop us." He marched out into the night. The snow was beginning to fall, swirling in the wind. It was dangerous. It was reckless. But Luke Callahan was done being afraid. He saddled the horses, his movements sharp and sure. He was riding into the storm, not to escape it, but to conquer it. The wind on the open prairie did not moan. It screamed. It was a sound torn from the throat of the earth itself, a high, thin shriek that vibrated in the marrow of Luke Callahan's bones. He rode hunched over the neck of his mare, his face wrapped in a wool scarf that was already stiff with ice. His eyes narrowed to slits against the biting sleet. The tracks were faint. The wind was scrubbing the land clean with a brutal efficiency, erasing the history of anything that dared to move across it. Luke leaned down, searching for the depression of a boot heel, a drag mark, anything that said Clara had passed this way. He found a scuff mark near a patch of sagebrush, already filling with drifting snow. "Clara!" he roared. The wind snatched the name from his lips and scattered it into the void. He shouted again, his voice raw, desperate. He knew the odds. He knew that a woman on foot, without proper gear, walking into a norther like this, had perhaps 2 hours before the cold shut down her heart. He kicked the mare forward. The horse fought him, tossing her head, wanting to turn tail to the wind. Luke forced her on. He was riding into a white wall, a nothingness that swallowed sound and light. Panic, cold and sharp as the ice in the air, began to claw at his chest. 2 miles ahead. Clara Hart was no longer walking. She was stumbling. Her feet had been numb for the last mile. Now, they felt like blocks of wood attached to her ankles, clumsy and unresponsive. She had fallen 3 times. The last time, it had taken a supreme effort of will to stand up. She clutched her thin coat around her chest. The cold was no longer painful. It had moved past pain into a strange, heavy sedation. She felt sleepy. She felt a bizarre, creeping warmth in her extremities that she knew was a lie. The final trick the body played before the end. She thought of the letter on the table. She hoped Annie wouldn't cry too long. She hoped Luke would find someone strong, someone clean, someone who could walk into the church on Sunday without heads turning. "You are doing this for them," she whispered, though her lips were too frozen to form the shapes of the words. Just keep walking, just a little farther. She aimed for a cluster of scrub oak in the distance, a dark smudge in the gray. If she could reach it, maybe she could rest, just for a minute, just close her eyes for a minute. She took a step, and her knee buckled. She hit the ground hard, tumbling into a shallow ditch half filled with drift. The snow was soft. It felt like a feather bed. Clara tried to push herself up, but her arms would not obey. She laid her cheek against the ice. It was peaceful here, out of the wind. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness behind her lids, she saw the glow of the stove in the cabin. She saw Annie's smile. She saw Luke's eyes, dark and full of a love she had never dared to believe in. Merry Christmas. Luke, she thought. Then the darkness took her. Back in Red Willow, the church bell tolled, a lonely, muffled sound in the storm. It was Christmas Eve. Inside the clapboard building, the air was thick with the smell of damp wool and beeswax candles. The Reverend Ralston stood at the pulpit, his voice booming about mercy and the birth of the Savior. In the pews, the townsfolk sat shoulder to shoulder, Mrs. Ralston sang the hymns loudly, her voice piercing and righteous. But beneath the singing, the whispers moved like a current. "Did you hear, Mrs.?" Miller whispered to her neighbor. "He left the child alone. Luke Callahan? Yes, rode out like a madman just before dark, chasing that woman. And the girl? Sick, they say, burning up with fever. The doctor was there earlier, said she was in a bad way. But the father, he chose the harlot over his own flesh and blood." They shook their heads, a collective judgment settling over the congregation. They pitied the child, certainly. But their pity was mixed with a grim satisfaction that their suspicions about Luke had been proven right. He was a man led astray. He was a cautionary tale. No one moved to leave the service. No one offered to ride out to the cabin. The storm was too bad, they told themselves. And besides, it was a family matter. A tragic, sinful family matter. Luke saw the dark shape in the ditch only because his horse shied away from it. He reined in hard, the mare dancing in the deep snow. He squinted through the gloom. It looked like a discarded sack of grain, half buried, but the shape was wrong. He threw himself from the saddle, landing in snow up to his thighs. He scrambled down the embankment, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Clara! He fell to his knees beside her. She was curled in a ball, her face turned into the drift. Luke grabbed her shoulders and turned her over. Her face was the color of candle wax. Her lips were a terrifying shade of blue. Ice had crusted over her eyelashes, sealing her eyes shut. She was not shivering. That was the worst sign. "Clara!" Luke screamed. He ripped his gloves off, pressing his warm hands to her cheeks. "Wake up! Damn it! Clara! Wake up!" He shook her, violently. Her head lolled back, limp as a rag doll. "Oh God, please!" Luke begged, his voice breaking into a sob. "Do not do this! You cannot leave me! I cannot lose you too!" He pulled her up, crushing her against his chest, rocking her back and forth. He buried his face in her icy neck. "I love you!" he yelled into the wind. "I love you, Clara. I do not care what they say. I do not care about the past. You are my life. Do you hear me? You are my life." Clara let out a small, ragged gasp. It was barely a sound, just a hitch in her chest. Luke pulled back, staring at her face. Her eyelids fluttered, cracking the ice. Brown eyes, dull and unfocused, rolled toward him. "Luke," she whispered, the sound a ghost of a voice. "I am here," he wept, smoothing the hair from her frozen forehead. "I am here. I have got you." "Go back," she mumbled, her eyes drifting shut again. "Annie, we are both going back," Luke said fiercely. He stood up, lifting her. She felt weightless, as if the wind had already hollowed her out. He struggled up the embankment, his boots slipping, his breath tearing at his throat. He reached the horse and, with a grunt of exertion, hoisted Clara into the saddle. He swung up behind her, wrapping his heavy sheepskin coat around both of them, bracketing her body with his own. He took the reins in frozen fingers and turned the mare's head back toward the faint lights of the valley. "Hold on," he whispered into her ear. "Stay with me. Clara, just stay with me." The ride back was a blur of suffering. The wind had shifted, driving needle-sharp sleet directly into their faces. The drifts were deeper now, the ravines treacherous pits of soft snow. Twice the mare stumbled, nearly going down, and Luke had to fight to keep them upright, his arms screaming with the effort of holding Clara safe. They reached the homestead well after dark. The cabin was a dark square against the snow, save for a faint, orange glow from the window. Luke slid off the horse, his legs buckling. He caught himself on the saddle stirrup, then reached up for Clara. She fell into his arms, barely conscious. He carried her inside, kicking the door open. The heat of the cabin hit him like a wall. He staggered to the bed and laid Clara down, then turned immediately to the pallet near the stove. Annie lay there, tangled in the quilts. Her face was flushed a violent red, her breathing coming in short, shallow rasps that sounded like a saw cutting through dry wood. "Daddy," she wheezed, her eyes glassy. "I am here." "Button," Luke said, dropping to his knees beside her. He touched her forehead. She was burning up. He looked back at the bed. Clara was struggling to sit up, her hands trembling as she tried to undo her coat buttons. "Do not move," Luke ordered. "You are half frozen. Annie." Clara gasped. "She needs water." Luke looked between them, the two halves of his heart, both fading. He felt a surge of terrifying clarity. There was no doctor coming. There was no help. It was just him. He moved. He stripped Clara of her wet outer clothes and wrapped her in dry blankets, rubbing her hands and feet briskly until she cried out from the pain of the blood returning. He poured hot coffee down her throat, forcing her to swallow. Then he turned to Annie. For the next 8 hours, the storm outside ceased to exist. The only world was the 12-by-12 room. Clara, despite her exhaustion, refused to stay in bed. She dragged herself to the stove. She soaked rags in cool water and wrung them out. She sat on one side of Annie's pallet while Luke sat on the other. They worked in a rhythm born of desperation. Luke lifted Annie's small shoulders so she could drink sips of willow bark tea. Clara sponged the heat from the child's face, murmuring soft, nonsensical songs. "You are all right, sweet girl," Clara whispered, her voice hoarse. "Just breathe. That is it. Just breathe. Sometime past midnight." Annie began to thrash. She called out for her mother. She called out for the wooden horse. Luke held her hands, tears streaming down his face, cutting tracks through the grime and stubble. He prayed. He wasn't a praying man, but he prayed now. He offered God everything, his land, his life, his pride. If only he would spare the child. Clara reached across the feverish girl and took Luke's hand. Her grip was weak, but steady. "She is strong. Luke," Clara said, her eyes meeting his. "She has your strength. She will not leave us." They held on to the child, and they held on to each other. The passion that had flared between them in the alley, the desire that had consumed them on the rug, was gone. In its place was something harder, deeper, and infinitely more durable. They were partners in the trenches of survival. The wind howled. The logs cracked. The lamp flickered and died, leaving them in the glow of the stove. And then, as the gray light of dawn began to seep through the frosted window, the miracle happened. Annie took a deep, shuddering breath. She coughed, not the dry, tearing sound, but a loose, productive cough. Her body went limp. Luke froze. "Annie?" He touched her forehead. It was damp with sweat, but the searing heat was gone. It was cool. The fever broke. Clara whispered, slumped against the wood box. Luke bowed his head, his shoulders shaking. He lifted Annie's hand and kissed the knuckles. "Thank God," he choked out. "Thank God." He looked at Clara. She was pale, dark circles bruising the skin under her eyes, her hair falling in wild tangles around her face. She looked wrecked. She looked magnificent. Luke moved around the sleeping child and pulled Clara into his arms. They leaned against the rough log wall, sliding down until they were sitting on the floor, wrapped in each other. "We did it," Luke whispered into her hair. "We are a family," Clara murmured, her eyes closing. "Just for tonight. Forever?" Luke said. By mid-morning, the sun broke through the clouds. It was a blinding, brilliant Christmas day. The storm had scoured the sky a deep, crystalline blue. In town, the guilt had started to set in. It began with the doctor, Doc Evans. He had not slept well. He kept thinking of the little girl alone in the cabin. He kept thinking of the look on Luke's face when he rode out. "I'm going out there," Evans announced to his wife over breakfast. "I do not care about the drifts. I will send food," his wife said quietly. Others felt it too. The storm's fury had passed, leaving behind a silence that felt judgmental. The rancher, Old Man Miller, harnessed his sleigh. The blacksmith saddled his horse. Even Mrs. Ralston, shamed by the sudden charity of her neighbors, packed a basket of dried ham and biscuits. A procession of 10 people made its way slowly across the dazzling white plain toward the Callahan homestead. They arrived to find the cabin still standing, smoke curling lazily from the chimney. Luke opened the door at the sound of the sleigh bells. He looked like a specter, unshaven, his eyes hollow, his clothes rumpled, but he stood tall. Doc Evans stepped forward. "Luke, we came to check on the girl. She is sleeping," Luke said quietly. The fever broke at dawn. A collective sigh of relief went through the group. Then, Clara appeared in the doorway behind Luke. She was wearing one of Luke's old flannel shirts over her dress. She looked tired, but she did not hide. She stepped up beside Luke, and his arm went around her waist instantly, an instinctive, claiming gesture. The townsfolk shifted uncomfortably. "Well," Pike's voice cut through the crisp air. Ephraim Pike sat in his black carriage at the back of the group. He had come not to help, but to witness the ruin he had orchestrated. "So, the prodigal father returns," Pike sneered, and he brought his whore back with him. The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. The doctor frowned. "Mrs. Ralston gasped. You have some nerve. Callahan, Pike continued, his voice rising, bringing that woman back into a Christian home after she abandoned you. But I suppose a woman from Silver Creek knows how to work a man, doesn't she? We all know what she sold in that mining town. We all know she is unfit to be within 10 miles of a child. Clara flinched, shrinking slightly against Luke. Luke stepped off the porch. He walked through the snow until he was standing by Pike's carriage. He looked up at the wealthy rancher, his eyes cold and hard as blue ice. Get down, Luke said. I beg your pardon? Pike sputtered. I said get down, or I will drag you down. Pike stayed where he was, gripping the reins. You are making a mistake. Callahan, I can ruin you. You have already tried, Luke said. And you failed. Luke turned to the crowd. He looked at Mrs. Ralston. He looked at the doctor. He looked at the shopkeeper. You want to know about Clara? Luke asked, his voice steady and carrying in the stillness. You want to know who she is? He pointed to the cabin. Last night, while you were all singing hymns in your warm church, this woman was on her knees on a dirt floor. She was freezing. She was exhausted. But she stayed awake for 12 hours straight to keep my daughter alive. She put wet cloths on a fever. She held a terrified child's hand. Luke's voice cracked, then hardened. Yes, she has a past. Yes, she has scars. And do you know who gave them to her? Men like Pike. Men who use women and then throw them away and call them dirty to make themselves feel clean. He looked back at Pike. You call her a whore. Ephraim, I found her half dead in a ditch because she walked out into a blizzard to save my family from your threats. She was willing to die alone in the snow, so you wouldn't take my daughter. Luke walked back to the porch and took Clara's hand, raising it. This woman has more honor in her little finger than you have in your entire bank account. Pike, she is not a stain. She is the only reason my daughter is breathing this morning. I owe her my life, and I love her. He looked at the townspeople, his gaze challenging them. If loving her makes me unfit in your eyes, if standing by the woman who saved my child makes me a sinner, then I accept your judgment. But do not you dare call yourself Christians while you cast stones at her. Silence stretched across the snow. It was absolute. Pike's face was a mottled purple. He opened his mouth to speak, to threaten, to bluster about debts and courts. That is enough. Ephraim, it was Doc Evans. He stepped forward, his bag in his hand. The man speaks the truth, and if I hear one more word against this family, I will stop treating your gout. Pike looked around. He saw the faces of the townspeople. He saw the shame in Mrs. Ralston's eyes. He saw the ranch hands looking at their boots. The tide had turned. The leverage was gone. He snapped his reins, turning his horses violently. The carriage lurched away, carving a retreating line through the snow. Doc Evans walked up the steps. I would like to check on Annie. Luke, if you will allow it. Luke nodded, stepping aside. Then, a woman stepped forward. It was Mrs. Miller, the rancher's wife. She walked up to Clara, who was trembling. Mrs. Miller reached into her basket and pulled out a thick, hand-knitted shawl. She placed it gently around Clara's shoulders. It is cold today, Mrs. Miller said softly. You keep warm, dear, and thank you for helping the little one. Clara touched the wool, tears spilling over her lashes. Thank you, she whispered. One by one, they came up. They didn't say much. A nod, a touch of the hat, a jar of preserves placed on the porch railing. Small, imperfect gestures of acceptance. It wasn't a parade, and it wasn't an apology. But it was a start. The thaw came in April. The creek swelled with meltwater, and the cottonwoods put out sticky green buds. Life did not become easy. The debt was still there, though Luke worked double shifts to pay it down. Pike still owned the valley, though he kept his distance. There were still people who crossed the street when Clara walked by, but the fear was gone. Luke and Clara were married in the small church in May. It was a quiet ceremony, attended by Annie, Doc Evans, and the Millers. When Luke kissed his bride, he didn't do it with shame. He did it with the fierce pride of a man who had walked through fire to find his gold. Annie grew stronger. The cough lingered, but it lost its terror. She thrived under the care of two parents who adored her. The town changed, slowly. Red Willow would never be a progressive place, but the sharp edge of its prejudice had been blunted. They saw Luke and Clara at the market, laughing. They saw Clara mending fences alongside her husband. They saw a family that had been forged in the hardest of winters, and they found it difficult to hate something so obviously solid. 2 years later, Christmas Eve. The cabin was sturdier now. Luke had added a room and reinforced the roof. The wood pile was stacked high, a fortress against the cold. Inside, the fire roared. The tree in the corner was a magnificent blue spruce, decorated with strings of popcorn, tin stars, and dozens of paper chains. Annie, now 9 and taller, stood on a chair to place the star on top. "Is it straight, Ma?" she asked. Clara stood back, wiping her hands on her apron. She was fuller in the face, her eyes bright and clear. She smiled. "It is perfect, Annie." Luke stood by the window, looking out. The snow was falling again, gentle and silent. The landscape that had once looked like a prison now looked like a painting. It was harsh. Yes, it was unforgiving. But it was home. He felt a hand on his arm. He turned to see Clara standing beside him. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "I was thinking about the ditch," Luke said softly. "I was thinking about how close I came to missing you." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "But you didn't. You found me." Luke turned and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, tasting of coffee and contentment. But beneath it ran the deep, steady river of that old, desperate love. "Merry Christmas, Clara. Merry Christmas, Luke." In the reflection of the dark window glass, the image of the three of them was suspended against the white backdrop of the American West. They were small against the vastness of the prairie, but they were together. And in the end, that was the only miracle that mattered. Closing message. Thank you so much for listening to this story of Luke, Clara, and Annie. It has been a journey through the blizzards and heartbreaks of the Wild West. And I hope their story of resilience and redemption touched your heart. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below and tell me which part of the world you call home. And if you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more tales of the frontier. Finally, I invite you to share your thoughts on the ending. Did Luke and Clara's journey resonate with you? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for your time. And until the next story, happy trails.